Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our exploration of the Impressionist era in painting. Now, this relatively short time period in art went on to influence art going forward into the 20th century. So from around the year 1870 through the end of the 1880s, this group of artists gathered, rethought how art was made, decided to challenge the traditional academic method, and caused all sorts of controversy. You know, it all started with a bunch of artists sitting around talking about why they made art, what was the purpose of art, and exploring ways that they could take this to new levels. What we're looking at here is a picture of a painter painting. And this is actually a portrait of Claude Monet painted by his friend, the artist Renoir. The Impressionist era was a time of change in how the artists related to their work and really to the medium of paint itself. As the Industrial Revolution continued into the mid to late 1800s, it spread across Europe and into the Americas. During this time, we have the introduction of the use of steel, electricity, and chemicals, as well as oil becoming widely used. The steam engine had a powerful impact on life overall, and we're just getting into the era of electricity, coming into the motor car and the telephone and recording, which would happen at the end of the 19th century. This expanding industrialization had an effect on urban life. Cities grew dramatically in response to improved hygiene and more opportunities for employment. They were almost to the time of the invention of the elevator and of air conditioning, which would take this expansion even further, but that happened maybe 20 or 30 years later than this time period. So, at the same time, in Europe, the writing of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, as they wrote in the Communist Manifesto, caused all sorts of waves in political and social order. The Communist Manifesto called for the working classes to overthrow the capitalist system, and this led to a backlash among the powers in authority and really a polarization in society. At the same time, Charles Darwin's pivotal work, The Origin of the Species, called long-held beliefs about where humans came from into question, as he said that humans evolved from apes, rather than from the biblical stories that had been held to be true before that time. So this atmosphere of change led people to call most aspects of life into question. And this is something that we see repeated throughout history. So we have all these new ways of thinking evolving under the umbrella term of modernism. Now, in this atmosphere, a small group of artists began meeting in cafes, discussing how their artwork might evolve to meet the new time as they rejected old standards and rules about art. One thing I find really fascinating about the Impressionist era and all of the changes that came after is that it was such a small group of artists that gathered in the cafes and went on their boat rides together and all of that, numbering under 20. Maybe if you add in the support people, the partners, and the gallery owners who were sympathetic to the new art, under 50 people brought about these changes in art that would result in a whole new way of perceiving and considering the creative process. To me, that speaks to the power that we all have to make change in our lives and in the broader world. So where did it all begin? Well, prior to the year 1871, Paris experienced years of turmoil. The Communist Manifesto led to a lot of upheaval as people questioned the status quo and the current political systems. Beginning in the year 1871, there was a renaissance as this time of turmoil came to a close. This renaissance is referred to as the Belle Epoque, or beautiful era. In the final months of the communist uprising, Much of the city was burned, and in that burning, slums were destroyed, the small avenues, and a lot of the quality of the city was changed forever. As Paris regained equilibrium, the government poured money into infrastructure. They cleared out the slums, and they built wide boulevards lined with cafes. Now, a small group of young visionary artists gathered at these cafes, and in their conversations over their wine as they pontificated about artistic philosophy and what was new and what was old, they redefined how art would be presented and perceived, and this paved the way for the modern art movement that would follow in the 20th century. One of the earliest paintings that influenced the Impressionists was by this artist, Edouard Manet. He's considered the founding father of Impressionism. This painting, in English it's called Luncheon on the Grass, is considered a seminal painting. Oh, but at the time it was painted, it was very scandalous. He submitted this painting to the Salon, the annual show that really all artists needed to get into, and it was rejected. So then he became part of the Salon des Refusés, or the Salon of the Refused. And this painting was displayed there, but it was behind a curtain, and women and children were not allowed to see it. So what about this painting was so scandalous? If we look at the history of art, nudes are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. But nudes could not be contemporary. For an artwork to be acceptable with a nude figure, it had to be from history or from mythology. In this case, the nudes are like, somebody you would see on the street. These are people just sitting around the park, and she's kind of thrown off her clothes. So now we would see, it's not a big deal. I mean, she's kind of modestly covered in a way. But at the time, this was very scandalous. Manet was an interesting artist in that he began to question the status quo of the academic system 10 or 15 years prior to the Impressionist movement. And the Impressionist movement, really the 1870s into the early 1880s. So we have a relatively small group of artists over 12 to 15 years that radically changed art. The piece upper right of the fife player was one that he submitted to the Salon in 1863, and yes, it was rejected. So he showed it at an alternative show. Why was it rejected? Well, when we compare it to the fine detail of the academic paintings that we looked at in the last lesson, it's much more simplified. These artists these revolutionary artists, the artists that became the Impressionists, they were saying, why? Why do we have to show this minute detail? Now, at the time, the new medium of photography was really taking care of that. So this is the artist himself. And this is a simple portrait that he has painted. Now, the portrait is included in this slideshow because of his beautiful use of I'll say, light within the shadow. The way that he's painted the shadow side of this figure makes it look almost illuminated. It's a simple portrait, and yet so beautiful. Look at the brush strokes that are visible in the garment. This is a really radical departure from what we saw in the academic era. So where do we get the name Impressionist? Well, this fellow named Claude Monet, who is really most associated with the Impressionist movement, painted this work called Impression Sunrise, and he displayed it at one of the Salons des Refusés. So at the time, it was just trashed by the critics. One critic wrote, these artists, they're just a bunch of Impressionists. And like many radicals throughout history, they thought, we'll take that insult and let's make it our name. Let's wear it proudly. So hence, the Impressionist era was born. Claude Monet was an artist who moved to Paris in 1862 as a young man. He came under the influence of Manet and of the whole Café Society movement, and he went on to be one of the foremost painters of the era. This painting on the right is of his wife and child, and Unfortunately, his wife died giving birth when she was just 32 years old. His first wife, many people believe his true love. But let's look at how he's painted this scene. Monet wrote that it was better to get the impression of a scene, to not look so far into details like, oh, that's an umbrella, that's a hat. Instead, to separate it out into light and shadow and form, and to put that on the canvas. One of the things that he did that was part of the technique of many of the Impressionists was that he would put paint daubs side by side, say a blue dot and a yellow dot, and then they would be mixed with the eye to create what we call optical blending. A blue dab and a yellow dab look like green when you back up and take a look at it. So this painting of his wife and child, you can really see the wind blowing. You can really get a sense of the day. Now, another thing that was really an important influence on the Impressionists seems quite simple, but it was radical. And that would be the invention of paint in tubes. Prior to this time, paint was mixed with a mortar and pestle, so the minerals would be ground in the studio and then mixed with linseed oil and then applied to the canvas. But once they put the paint into the tubes, you could just go out into the day and paint anywhere. And that had a radical impact on the artists. Let's look at a couple of more works by Manet. This one is actually from London, and it's a cathedral, but if you look at it, it is such a simple statement. And you can really see how he has used the optical blending in the water. Now, whether it's your cup of tea or not, it's good to consider how far this is from the academic paintings that we have seen that were painted just really 10 or 15 years earlier. And in fact, were still being painted in the late 1800s. One of the things that the Impressionist artists believed in was light. They were students of light, so they would study a setting in all different times of day. Often they would set up their easels and have 3 or 4 paintings going at once. So there would be a morning painting and an early afternoon painting, and then a late evening painting. That's what we see here in Monet's famous Haystack series. We have various seasons and light, all of the same subject. In looking at Monet's work, you'll see that he did this frequently. So let's move on. This is an artist who is considered an Impressionist or from the same group, although his art is a little bit more realistic. You can see that it has a stylization that we'll see quite a bit more in the early 20th century. And this is Gustave Caillebotte, and it's called The Floor Scrapers. I find this a really beautiful painting, both in its simplicity and in its composition. Notice how the artist has used the lines of the floor to draw your eye through it. And there's important details like the bottle on the right that breaks it up a little bit. So here's another painting by Caillebotte that we saw earlier in the lesson. It depicts what Paris might have been like in the late 1800s. The artist Camille Pissarro was seen as an elder. He was quite a bit older than most of the young Impressionist painters, and he was a sort of a father figure. His work typically has a lot of the optical blending, a lot of dots, as we see in this painting here on the left. Look closely at the woman's skirt on the left side of the left painting. Well, on all of the skirts, you see how there's just dots all put together. Now, Pissarro would actually work and give money to the younger Impressionist painters as he supported the movement, and he also served as sort of a mentor to many of them. Here's one of the artists that is most widely known, and that would be Auguste Renoir. As we look at all of these different artists, I invite you to notice that they each have their unique quality, but they also share some characteristics. Renoir was known to have a real zest for life, and his work reflects that. All of his women figures, his female figures, seem to be sort of bursting with life. He had an exuberance to his painting. In his use of color, he rarely used black, except for you can see that in the garment on the right. and you see it in certain areas, but in his shadows, he tended towards a softer palette. One of his most famous works is Luncheon of the Boating Party. So what these guys would do is they would go out and boat, and then they would stop and have lunch. In fact, the artist Monet actually had a painting boat made so he could float around in the water and paint. Here we have many of the artists themselves and the models portrayed. Each of these figures, were we living in that time, we would recognize them. I think that's probably Suzanne Valadon right there. Who else do I see here? I can't really, oh, that would be Degas over there, etc. And maybe that's Monet with the top hat. So this is actually a portrait of all the friends having lunch together. Now, speaking of Degas, Edgar Degas was a classically trained painter. He came from a wealthy family, so he could pursue his art without concern for making a living. During the Impressionist era, he shifted to creating looser works, and he worked in both pastel and oil. One interesting fact about this artist is he didn't want to claim the name Impressionist, but he did display his work with the Impressionist artists. Most people think of him as being the painter of ballerinas, and we will look at those in a moment. But he also painted many other subjects. The unifying theme among his work is his unusual compositions. He would consciously break the rules in quotations, of composition and create interesting and very effective paintings. One of the things I like to say to my painting students is you learn the rules to break the rules. And that's something that Edgar Degas did very effectively. Here's one of his ballerina paintings, and it's a good example of that. So many people think of Degas as, he painted dancers, but there's more to it than that. When he painted dancers, he did not paint them in the most graceful form. He tended to find the sort of backstage moments. Or now it's a dancer working with his teacher and the musician. You can see the guy here is just about to start playing violin, and the other dancers are just sort of standing around and stretching. To be in the ballet, or it was also the opera, a young girl, this was a way up for many young girls, but it was a very tough life also. So these were generally women from the lower to middle classes who worked very hard to find their place and to find a livelihood in society. This composition, if you look at it, in the center of the composition is really nothing, but we have a connection between the dancer on the left and the dance instructor on the right. Notice how the woman right here, that this pointing foot leads us right back around, as does the bar that the dancers are stretching on. So it looks almost haphazard, but in fact it's a very well considered and a carefully designed composition. Degas was a pioneer in the use of photography to create his compositions. Check out the work on the left. Some of you in art classes have used a grid where you would mark a photograph with blocks, as we see here, and then put the blocks on a larger piece, proportionally equivalent, and then enlarge it. And that's something that Degas obviously did, as we see here. This sculpture on the right is part of a series of wax sculptures that were found after his death. He had many of them, and most of them were destroyed. This one was called The Little Dancer, and when he first displayed it, she was wearing actual fabric and she had a bow, just like we see here. But the critics hated it. They called it like the ugly dancer, and he was so offended that he never showed his sculptures again. They were actually maquettes, or figures that he could use in his studio to help him to create his paintings. But he was a wonderful sculptor as well. However, Degas was known to be a sort of a reclusive figure, and he was obviously offended by that remark, and that was it. He never again displayed his sculptures. And one final example from this artist, which you may guess is one of my favorites. is Woman with Chrysanthemums. And I often use this one to demonstrate how you can consciously break the rules of composition to great effect. So if I was teaching composition, I would say do not have a figure looking out of the composition near the edge. In particular, don't do this on the right side, because we read from left to right. And if we're reading from left to right, our eye is just going to fly off the page, following the gaze of the sitter. However, what Degas has done here is so masterful. He has placed this huge flower bouquet and the gloves and the water to balance the woman looking off. And I find it quite powerful, a very beautiful composition. One of the strong influences on Degas and on many of the Impressionist artists was Japanese woodblock prints. In the 1860s, Japan opened trade with the West, and Japanese style became all the rage in Europe. So these woodblock prints provided great inspiration for their compositions. The European artists resonated with the unusual placement and the clean compositional lines used in the woodblock prints. Now, in addition to the woodblock prints, Japanese fans and kimonos and everything Japanese was quite fashionable. That elder artist that we talked about earlier, Camille Pissarro, he would paint Japanese-style fans, and he would sell them and use this money to support the younger Impressionist painters. Another artist who was strongly influenced by Japanese prints and who was a close friend of Degas was Marie Cassatt. Marie Cassatt was an American artist. She was from Philadelphia. But she was an expat. She relocated to Paris, where she stayed for the remainder of her life, and, as I said, was a close friend to Degas. If you look at the print on the right, this is actually a woodblock print that she did called The Letter, and it's closely modeled after the Japanese prints that inspired it. Most of her paintings were of women and children, and that's what she's really known for. But here is a painting of her sister, and her sister happens to be holding a Japanese fan. This image is much more typical of Marie Cassatt. She worked in both oil paints and in pastels, but this looks to be an oil painting. The artist Berthe Morisset was another important Impressionist artist, and she happened to be married to Edouard Manet's brother. So this is her husband and child depicted outside. And you can see here, Berthe Morisset had a very distinctive style of loose brushwork, no detail. And this is really radically different than we see with the academic paintings. Another artist of the era who was sort of at the center of it all socially was Suzanne Valadon. Suzanne was raised in the Montmartre, the artist district of Paris, in sort of a bohemian life. Her mother was an eccentric and had a drinking problem, so that left Suzanne to really roam the streets without much parenting. And she became a familiar sight on the streets, known for her attitude and for her sort of pluckiness. As she grew older, she began to paint herself, but also her house became a center for the artists to gather. And all of the great Impressionist artists would come and hang out at Suzanne's house and drink wine and talk late into the night. Her son was named Maurice, and he grew up to be the artist Maurice Utrillo. Unfortunately, he had his own share of problems. He struggled with alcoholism and with some emotional trouble, but he created these paintings that were quite popular in his day. Even though he had these mental health issues, there's stories of his mother working to help him to find at least enough stability to make his paintings. These are two typical paintings that depicted the city life or the life of the Bohemian district. And it was very widely collected at the time. Hey, let's move over to the Americas. Well, this guy, he lived in London actually, but he came from America. And that would be James McNeill Whistler. Many of you might know him for painting Whistler's mother. Hey, but here's a newsflash. This is not his mother, and he called it Arrangement in Gray and Black. The purpose of the painting was to study a composition in gray and black, and that was really it. He hired a model, and yet it became a kind of a quintessential American painting, but that was never his intention. This painting on the left was more his cup of tea as he continued as an artist. He did live in London, but this painting called Nocturne in Black and Gold was just trashed by a critic. It received a scathing review, and he sued the critic for libel. In the court, there's famous court transcripts of how he's trying to describe his method of painting, and it's scoffed at by people in the courtroom. Ultimately, he did win the suit, but the judge awarded him like a half a penny, and he also charged him for all the court fees, which ruined Whistler financially. When we look at James Whistler's work, we can see what's to come. We can see modern art just peeking around the corner as he moved further and further away from realism into a feeling. Now these, I think they're fireworks. There's a whole series that he did of a fireworks display. So if you know that about this painting and you consider what it would be like to stand at the edge of water at night while fireworks were shooting off in the sky, it's really a rather realistic depiction. So one final painting that really sums up the era. This is the Bar at Folies Bergère by Edouard Monet, the grandfather of the Impressionist era. We'll start with him and we'll end with him. Now, a lot of what the Impressionists did was hang around in cafes and bars and drink and talk about art. And you can see that that might become jaded. A person might become jaded after a while of living this life. So this painting is painted in 1882, and there's quite a lot to it. First, I'd like you to notice the beautiful still life in the foreground. Also, notice the feet. See, there's a trapeze artist up here. There's a woman with a magnifying, like binoculars right here, opera glasses, looking at a different show. So what this would be a huge bar with multiple entertainments happening at once. You can see there's a chandelier. Now note what we're looking at behind the bar is a reflection. So this is a mirror behind the bar. We have the woman, her reflection, and she's speaking to a man. What might that man be asking her? Maybe he's simply asking for a bottle of wine or champagne, but the general theory is that he's asking for something else. He's asking for an after-hours transaction, so to speak. If you're able to zoom in or to look closely at this painting, there is a profound vacancy in the eyes of this barmaid. And with this beautiful face, he has captured so much about the Impressionist era as it wound down. While these artists started 12 to 15 years earlier, really excited to buck the trends. After 12 to 15 years of partying, of hanging out in the bars, Edouard Manet captured a sort of sadness around all of that. So this era would wind down and lead into the post-Impressionist era. And just ironically enough, the Impressionists came up with rules for what you had to do to be an Impressionist. And the next group of artists that came through rebelled against those rules, just as the Impressionists had rebelled against the rules of the academic era. And they started their own school, which would be post-Impressionism. And that will be the next subject that we'll cover. In the meantime, hey, thanks for listening.